So as we continue our journey in No Fake Smiles, it reminded me of several years ago when I was at seminary. Some of you may know I went to Perkins School of Theology at SMU and spent several years of my life there. One of the things that I participated in was what was known as seminary singers. Seminary singers was a group of seminarians, some of whom could sing and some of whom could not sing. And they would let us go on tour with choir tours. Now, Reverend Karen was in the seminary singers as well. She happens to know how to sing. You probably already know that. She came in decades after me because she's much younger than me. So we didn't cross paths during seminary. But one of the great wonders of seminary singers was we would go on tour. We would go east one year, north one year, west one year, right, all that kind of stuff. And one of the beautiful gifts was we would sing in churches, we would stay in people's homes and receive their hospitality. You have provided that many a time throughout the years when we've had guest choirs here, you've had people in your homes, and it's that hospitality that is such a gift that is offered to people, right? It involves everything from making a meal for the choir that comes, listening to the performance, waiting for the musicians to get finished and packed up, taking them to their home, transporting them, visiting with them, engaging in conversation, providing lodging, obviously, and then, of course, breakfast in the morning, and then transportation back up to the church. All of that is an amazing gift to those of us or those who've come here because it's genuine hospitality. It's a welcoming opportunity. It's a gift of relationship. And I cherish that and laud that, both what I have received, what we've been able to offer to other people. And I just lift that up as a great example. And at the same time know that that's kind of what I call the beginning of hospitality. That's a great first step of hospitality. That's a tangible and yet beginning kind of step into biblical hospitality, which is what we're trying to glean a little bit more about throughout this season of January during this worship series called No Fake Smile, where we're trying to recognize that biblical hospitality calls us not only to be great hospitable guests on Sunday morning when we receive first-time guests or people coming back for the second or third time, but also the ways in which we live in the world, in our workaday world, in our everyday world, in the grocery store or in community or in other nonprofit organizations. We want to demonstrate with our lives, the way in which we live, biblical hospitality. And that gift calls us into a specific way of being that's more than just opening our home, though that is a tremendous gift, but the ways in which we help love the stranger. And that's what we learned last week. If you were with us last week, I'm going to do a real quick review. If you weren't here last week, hopefully this will be something that will be beneficial for you. But in the New Testament, every time we see the word hospitality, it comes from the original Greek. The New Testament was written in Greek. And that Greek word is philoxenia. And philoxenia literally means love of stranger. Well, that word, philoxenia, is what is translated into the English as hospitality. And so we are, in the ways in which we live out hospitality, desired to love the stranger, whoever that is. Whether it's the first time we've met them or somebody we've just met or whatever, we want to love that stranger. The other thing we learned last week was that our own English word hospitality, not straight from the Greek, but just the English that it came out of, it's related at its core to some other words that have tangible connection as well, like hospice, which means shelter. And we still offer hospice care as a shelter for those who are in their last days, right? And the word hospital, which means healing. This is the place to which we go to receive healing, right? So hospice and hospital help lead us to the word hospitality, which for us as followers of Jesus literally means to provide the shelter of God's healing. That's hospitality. And so we're to love the stranger and to offer this healing of God's shelter for people, and that's very encompassing, right? It's more than a friendly handshake and a wave or a hello, how are you doing? It's how do I live? And how does this have an impact on who I am in relationship to other people? And so it makes me sort of ponder a little bit about our sort of basic understanding of hospitality. I wonder, for instance, if it's not just a little bit more than how am I helping people or how am I hosting people? I think it might go a couple of steps further, like How are my guests or these new people in my life, how are they feeling? How am I honoring their story, whatever that story is? How am I helping to celebrate their presence with me and with us? How am I taking care of their needs? You see, it goes further. It's why I cherish the vision that this church has claimed over the last few years, because that vision encompasses this idea. Remember, our vision is we envision a community where people matter, brokenness is healed, and love is lived. And for us, that's our language of God's kingdom. This is what we're trying to build. We're trying to build a community where we're trying to build a world where people matter and brokenness is healed and love is lived. And as we do that, we help create God's world. We help create God's intention in the world. And really, that's who are like anybody else, whether in today's world or in biblical days. The tax collector is not exactly a well-liked person, right? I mean, nobody really likes giving the government taxes. We know they're necessary. We know they serve a purpose, but it's not exactly our favorite endeavor. And in Jesus' day, the tax collectors were despised, right? I mean, nobody liked them, not the least of which is because they're taking the taxes, but because the way in which they take the taxes, and everybody dislikes that, so they dislike them. So Zacchaeus is an isolated, ostracized, outcast kind of guy. Nobody wants to talk to him. Nobody wants a relationship with him. Nobody would be caught dead going to his house. He's a chief tax collector. And oh, by the way, he's one of those rich guys, and we don't like those rich guys, right? I mean, just all that kind of impression. So when Jesus says and comes to town, I've got to go to your place, everybody in the community's like, why? Why would you want to do that? And why would you go over there? And this is not a good thing, right? Part of what Jesus begins for us in the very act of saying, Zacchaeus, I must go to your house today, is he begins to open up the door of this biblical hospitality. He begins to sort of demonstrate for us what that looks like. And the very first component of that biblical hospitality is, I got to cross a border. I've got to cross the border that we have created for Zacchaeus. I mean, he created some of it himself, right? He's a chief tax collector. Nobody likes him. But I got to cross the border of him being a tax collector, of him being kind of rich, of him being kind of standoffish and being somebody who takes and skims off the top. Oh, by the way, and no offense to anybody, but he's short, and nobody likes short people either, right? At least in the biblical days, right? I just want to, So we got to cross a border. In order for Jesus to spend time with Zacchaeus, to welcome Zacchaeus, he's got to cross several different borders. And he's got to say to the world and present to the world this desire to be in relationship with Zacchaeus. And just to sort of paint a picture of how poorly people thought of tax collectors in the day, there are several instances in Scripture in the New Testament when Jesus spends time with tax collectors, and without exception, everyone lifts them up as a special kind of sinner, right? I mean, consider Matthew himself, one of the 12 disciples. Matthew was called Levi. He was a tax collector himself. He was among those despised. But when Jesus calls him, we're told in Matthew chapter 9 that when the Pharisees see this, they say to Jesus' disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? I mean, they're a special kind of sinner, right? And so they're lifted up. And several times, if you read the New Testament, you'll see that they are lifted up as the worst kind of sinners, having their own category of sin. But Jesus steps across that border and engages a relationship with Zacchaeus. We are called to step across those borders, those boundaries, those walls that we build or erect that keep us separate from other people. Biblical hospitality calls us to push through or walk past and engage that relationship. Notice what Jesus says, I must come to your house today. It's in that compilation that Jesus begins to help us see that if we'll choose to step across those borders, hospitality can heal the brokenness of isolation and exclusion. And we're called to that as people of God, that we would literally help break that bondage and heal that brokenness. That becomes very important. And it's in the compellingness of that that Jesus wants to walk into that. It's much like our own vision. When our vision says to us, we envision a community where people matter and brokenness is healed and love is lived, that compels us to go out and live that, to be that very thing, right? Jesus was compelled over and over to share the gospel. We're told as a simple, for instance, in Luke's gospel in the 4th chapter, that in talking to his disciples, Jesus says, I must go share the good news of the kingdom of God. It's not a, well, I hope that all works out kind of thing, right? It's not a, man, I hope everything falls in place so that I can kind of thing. It's a, I must. And so as followers of Jesus, a part of what we must do is to step across those borders. Because our vision compels us to love the stranger, to demonstrate this philoxenia, to be people of love for those who are different, for those who are despised, for those who may not be a part of us, whoever us is, right? That's what we're called to do. But sometimes stuff gets in the way, doesn't it? I mean, like rules and regulations, things that sort of are maintained to keep distances or create these opportunities, right? I mean, we religious folk are good at that, right? Well, you shouldn't do that, and therefore I'm not going to be in relationship with you. Or that's a bad thing and that's a sin, and so I'm going to kind of keep my distance because I don't want to do that. And on the surface level, that's appropriate, right? We want to kind of keep good company. We want to do the right thing. But at the same time, it sort of flies in the face of what Jesus calls us to do. And that's why it's hard. Because we know right from wrong, and we know that we're not supposed to sin, and we know that we're always supposed to do the right thing. But we also know that Jesus calls us to love the stranger, to love our neighbors, to love those who are unlovable, to pray for our enemies, right? He calls us to do all those things. And so part of what we've got to recognize is what Jesus is doing with Zacchaeus is choosing relationship over rules. And Jesus always chooses relationship over rules. I mean, there are several instances, but I highlight just a couple. Remember the woman at the well, we're told in John chapter 4. She's a Samaritan woman, and she's drawing water in the middle of the day, which means she's been ostracized from her own kin. And she's Samaritan and a female, and therefore Jesus ought not to have any kind of conversation with her. I mean, she's a Samaritan after all, and she's a woman in a public place, and therefore as a Jewish male, that's a big no-no. That's the rule. But Jesus chooses relationship over rule and engages with her, offers her powerful images of how he saves and how he is the living water. I think likewise of the woman caught in adultery. She's clearly done the wrong thing. She has clearly sinned, and John chapter 8 acknowledges that. And Jesus comes among all those whose arms are cocked and ready to throw the first stone because the rule is, this is what we do. She's committed adultery. But Jesus chooses relationship over rule because of biblical hospitality. He's never met her before. He clearly knows she has sinned. He challenges her not to do it again. But the very first thing he does is offer her salvation, grace, mercy, and that changes who she is. You see, Jesus always chooses relationship over rules, and so should we as his followers. This is the image of biblical hospitality, loving the stranger, providing God's shelter of healing for those that need it, right? And notice what happens to Zacchaeus because Jesus chooses relationship over rules. He is transformed. He is made new. I mean, remember, he's a tax collector, he's a skimmer, he's a stealer, he's a fraud. And instantly, because Jesus has loved him, has cared for him, has wanted to be with him in his home, Zacchaeus makes two very profound statements that to you and me seem fairly minimal, but are really huge. I'm going to pay back half of all that I've taken from the poor, and I'll pay back 4 times as much of those that I've defrauded. Now, the law, the rule, was not nearly that much. I mean, if you look at Leviticus, your favorite book of the Bible, where the laws, some of the laws at least, are contained, if you read Leviticus chapter 6, it expresses what the penalty or payment is for defrauding. Literally, it says if you've obtained something by swearing falsely, in other words, you've defrauded somebody, you're to pay it back, the value, plus 20%. He's paying back 4 times as much. That's how transformed his heart is. That's how committed to Jesus he now is. That's how much his desire is to be a part of what Jesus is doing, and all because Jesus loved him first, offered him shelter for healing in his life, acknowledged that he was a human of value made in the image of God. You see, when people matter more than rules, transformation happens. Every time. Notice the order. When people matter more than rules, transformation happens. Zacchaeus was saved that day. His life was made over. He became new. He was a different person. All because somebody welcomed him. Somebody loved him. Somebody provided a kind of shelter for the healing of his heart. Man, that's Jesus' doing. And we are the followers of that doer. We are the ones who can offer the same. This is Jesus' vision of the kingdom of God, where people matter, brokenness is healed, and love is lived. And Jesus' vision, it ought to be our vision. It ought to be who we are. It ought to be what we're about. This is biblical hospitality. It's the way of Jesus. And that's why we want to learn it better. We want to do it better. We want to be better at loving our neighbors who might be strangers to us at some point. And we want to welcome people into our homes or into our lives or into our hearts. Now, I'm well aware that when we talk this language of loving the stranger, crossing borders, offering shelter of God's healing, that it can feel overwhelming. It could feel like, wow, how can I do that? What do I need to do? Well, it starts simply. It starts with basic concepts. You know, all Jesus did was to tell the world that he needed to stay with Zacchaeus. He honored his story. He celebrated his presence. He took care of his need. That can all happen on very simple levels. Let me just offer a couple. There are hundreds, but just a few. Like when I'm engaged in a conversation with somebody that I may not know well or may not know at all, one thing can be that I simply intentionally listen. Not to respond, well, here's what I think about that, or here's how that really ought to be, or here's what this really is, right? But just listen. Honor their story. Hear them out. Help them to know that they are valued enough to listen to. right? That's simple, right? Following off of that is another simple one. Seek to understand. As I'm listening, seek to understand rather than to be understood. This is what it ought to be, and this is how it should, right? Let me tell you. I mean, this is a basic of Stephen Covey, right? 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Seek to understand rather than be understood. Oh, by the way, some 800 years prior to Stephen Covey, a guy named Francis of Assisi wrote a poem about it. Seek to understand rather than be understood. We can all do that, right? Another simple one is engage a relationship. If you encounter somebody for the very first time, engage with them. Acknowledge that they're there. A panhandler on the side of the road, you don't necessarily have to give them cash, but acknowledge that they're human. Talk with them. Ask them how they're doing. Share something of your own day. Let them know that God cares. That can all happen just from our mouths. That's hospitality. And then this last one is a bit unique, but I want to challenge us. Notice what Jesus did with Zacchaeus. He accepted his hospitality. What would it be like if every once in a while I accept hospitality from somebody else? What if I receive rather than sort of quote unquote always being the giver, always offering myself? See, when I receive, it helps me to see the world slightly differently. When I receive, instead of giving, it helps me to look at the world with different eyes. And by the way, this is the way the gospel was shared in the first century of Christianity. Paul and Silas and Barnabas, they went from town to town and not only began churches, but they stayed in people's homes and they accepted their hospitality. And only after they accepted the hospitality, having been with these people in their homes, eating their food, sharing life with them, did they then share the good news of Jesus Christ. Because when I receive hospitality from others, I am saying to them with my heart and with my life and with my words, you are a person of value whom I cherish, and I'm willing to let you help me, and I'd love to offer you something now after you have first helped me. Hospitality is a fascinating thing, isn't it? It is the way of the kingdom. It is the way Jesus works. It is what we are called to every single day, loving the stranger and offering a shelter of healing for anybody we may come in contact with. I pray that we'll begin that journey if we haven't already. And I pray that if we're on that journey, we'll take even more steps down the path. May it be so that we can build God's kingdom here on earth, just as it is in heaven. Will you pray with me? Holy and gracious God, thank you for the gift of hospitality, for the powerful ways in which Jesus regularly crossed borders, offered grace and mercy, received care, and demonstrated every day a love of stranger. Help us, Lord, to be the same as his followers. Help us to challenge ourselves to take on philoxenia. Help us, Lord, to do what it is you're calling us to do. May we have your courage and may we have your faithfulness as we seek to be people of faith. God, this is our prayer, and we lift it in the name of Jesus, whom we know to be the Christ. Amen. Hey, friends, for the powerful ways you not only demonstrate hospitality, but your generosity makes ministry possible every single day, I just want to say thanks. You helped us to finish 2024 tremendously well, and we're well on our way in 2025 to being a congregation not only of hospitality, but of generosity. I'd love for you to hear the story of how your Christmas Eve offering will help us generously build a new home through Habitat for Humanity for somebody who needs one. Hey friends, Pastor Daniel here. As we enter this new year, I'm so excited about your generosity and the ways you helped us both finish out 2024 so well, and the ways in which, as we step into 2025, your generosity helps ministry happen every single day. Especially today, I'd love to share with you how your generosity is making a difference for our new Habitat for Humanity Interfaith Build in the spring. You may recall we've helped with Habitat for Humanity on a number of occasions. This will be our third interfaith build with different communities of faith coming together to help build homes for people who might not otherwise be able to afford it. On our Christmas Eve worship experiences, you contributed over $25,000 to make a gift towards this new interfaith build for 2025. Thank you for that amazing generosity that will help people find a new, warm, safe place to live. I'm so grateful for the ways your generosity is making a difference. To help make ministry possible in all kinds of ways, I invite you to make a gift in any way that is helpful for you. You can scan the QR code on the screen, go to tmumc.org/give, or text the letters TMUMC to the number 45777. But whatever you give, we're really, really grateful.